Thanks very much, Graham. Yes, yeah, very embarrassing introduction there, I say. Okay, well, thanks very much, everyone, for coming. I will introduce myself for those who don't know me. So yeah, James Toon. I'm the product manager with the responsibility here for the award management module, and obviously the award management module is the best part of Pure by some margin. So just just obviously for those that don't know, so the award management module is different from a lot of other modules we have in Pure. Its specific intention is to sort of make this transition between becoming essentially a catalog system of information into an actionable research management system. So it kind of occupies that interesting space where we're actually having to deal with institutional processes and how we kind of implement those processes. It covers kind of four broad sort of areas. So that of the research development area is something we've been working on relatively recently as well. So bringing in funding opportunities and using those funding opportunities in different ways to be able to then start springboarding applications. We aim to make the submission, so basically the creation of proposals and the submission of those proposals as high quality as possible on the basis that the better quality submission equals a much better success. Once those applications have been submitted and subsequently awarded, we then want to be able to support that management of post-award compliance, so getting off the ground, as it were, with getting started with the investigators and making sure that those awards are managed in the longer term. And also then, ultimately, to be able to kind of take forward the research activity that's produced as a consequence of that funding and showcasing it in an appropriate way, both for building storytelling and narratives on public portals, but also to support internal reporting and funder reporting, so making sure that the individuals funding the research get better sight of actually what's being produced as a consequence of it. So as I mentioned in the roadmap session yesterday, and the eagle-eyed viewers among you will notice that these numbers are in fact different. So this is an earlier set of numbers. We've now gone up to 125 users globally. But this is, again, the point of emphasis of this particular slide was really just to say that actually award management isn't something that only happens in, for example, the UK and Europe. It's very, very prevalent globally. We have a number of hotspots across the world, but ultimately it is a growing requirement, and it in itself introduces an enormous amount of challenges to us, because then we have to start working on the research processes that operate globally. So you're never ever going to build a one-size-fits-all solution. It has to be a solution that is ultimately as configurable and customizable as possible, but without being too loose that makes it impossible to kind of all hold together. So always a bit of a difficult thing. And then just doing a recapping on the vision. So when we started reinvesting in the award management module back in 2021, I think it was, when we actually started on that, we decided to set ourselves a vision of how we wanted the award management module to be for our customers kind of going forward. So this is just kind of recapping that. And over the years, the sort of strapline part at the top has changed a little bit, but it's broadly the same. But the principles are exactly the same. We want to get this single system that lets universities navigate their entire funding life cycle. And again, just kind of capping through those core stages. But in doing so, being able to kind of bring together all that work so that everyone can, we can manage, we can simplify, we can improve processes, we can communicate more effectively between ourselves within the teams, to schedule, to service, to centralize and connect. So all the sorts of stakeholder requirements you would see within a highly functioning research office. So that's our ultimate goal, is to make it all that possible. That's kind of singular vision we want to look at within it. So what have we done over the years? So we've been basically working through a very complex and interconnected set of processes. So the diagram we have has probably 200 or 300 individual kind of tasks and steps on it overall. But we can boil those down into these kind of key jobs to be done. So first of those, find funding. So Pure has pretty much always had a funding opportunities content type. But in the past few years, we've done a number of different things with it. One of which, of course, is that we've integrated in with funding institutional. So as an external kind of funding opportunities database that Elsevier manages, as that's been improved, we've been able to kind of bring more useful and actionable information in from that. And most recently, one of the things we did, of course, in funding opportunities was we made it possible to create internal funding opportunities that were giving institutions the ability to be able to kind of start kind of building out their own funding programs, to be able to manage them themselves, but also to support some additional functions that we have, like, for example, internal competition. So where you might need to be doing rate limiting on bids that are coming in from external kind of agencies as well, where you want to kind of run through an expression of interest process followed by a full submission process. So the internal kind of opportunities content type has now made that possible. The second part, of course, is in and around proposal development. So our application cover sheet essentially allows us to be able to bring together all the information we need. So there's obviously the core metadata that exists within that form, which we can put in. But we've also introduced a bunch of new functionalities in here as well to support that process. Notably things like, for example, the review content type. The review content type was introduced as a very specific means to be able to kind of create survey-like forms which we can then use to send to necessary individuals during the process of setting up an application to be able to kind of ask pertinent questions that might help inform the approval workflows. So for example, things like, do I have a conflict of interest check? Do I have a need to run an early stage ethical review assessment? And do I need to look at export control requirements and so on and so forth? We've also introduced milestones on the application content type as well. They used to be only available on awards, but now that means we can start to build out checklist items as well. So through the process of approval, we can say, well, actually, I've got 5 key things that I always have to do when this is an EU grant. I want to make sure they are all kind of delegated to the right individuals and signed off appropriately as we go within there. And again, most recently, the contract content type we've added in here, which also lets us build things in like NDA opportunities in sort of pre-award setups as well. Managing approvals has been a huge one for us. The main theme of the second part of this presentation, actually, which is introducing a brand new kind of means to be able to kind of process the internal approval workflows. So this is the process manager workflow, which is an integrated solution we put in the back end of Pure, allows us to be very, very kind of customizable in terms of how we address those flows, and allows us also to be able to kind of build very customizable flows out for individual application types. So your simple expression of interest flow might be 2 steps, but a full proposal might end up being 50, 60 steps. You know, how you can kind of go nuts, right? It's one of those things. It's either good and bad depending on your measure. But interestingly enough, where we see people with highly complex customer definable flows using that more linear model, more typically we see them actually kind of bringing that down into a smaller kind of group within the process manager. So it has this kind of net benefit of simplifying in some scenarios, which has been quite interesting. Setting up awards. So this was always a bit of an interesting issue for us, because at the point when an application has been accepted by a funder, the subsequent process of then securing the necessary agreements, running through the ethical review requirements, getting contracts set up, was always a little bit of an air gap for us. So we actually wanted to kind of plug that. So that was the main kind of goal behind the contract content type in particular, which we added in relatively recently as well. But we've also done some additional work on supporting, for example, reviews on ethical reviews, so we can now start to use that content type much more directly as well within the system. And just generally kind of trying to kind of improve that sort of piece within here. So some of the statuses have changed as well, and so forth. So again, improvements there. From a post-award point of view, we've got obviously the existing kind of setup with masters and so forth within here. But some of the things we've done here, for example, is relatively recently we've added some additional kind of opportunities in some of the financial reporting parts. So about 8 months ago or so, we introduced the ability to be able to start recording commitments data across awards. And we did this very specifically because we wanted to be able to kind of give that chance for PIs who are looking at project details within their system to see where that committed data lies. And obviously the main reason for that is you don't want PIs saying, oh, look, I've got a spare million I can use on buying kind of sweets and things like that. So they might, if you've got that physically kind of stored out for salaries or for equipment or whatever it is, we want to make sure that's actually recorded in there so that we kind of catch that in. But it also means that if anything comes in on the application funding that we see that shouldn't be there, it gives early sight for a PI to be able to then go back to their administrators and talk about what they might need to be doing to remediate those problems. So pretty crucial from that point of view. And then obviously the setup of projects is a case that hasn't changed largely, but obviously working on the portal and the new Pure portal as well, in terms of how we start representing project information, is starting to form how we might want to start showcasing a bit more effectively within there. And ultimately, again, within outcome management, so making sure we can bring data in from publications, data sets, impact, etc., and linking that back into the actual kind of funding awards. And we have some plans in here, which is something I'm hoping I might be able to talk about at the next conference, in terms of how we're able to kind of improve the way we deal with funding information coming through and representing that against projects. So there's a whole big chunk of work there on these kind of jobs to be done, and we're pretty happy. We've done a lot of work on that, hence the ticks. Of course, there's a ton more to do, and there are many things, many opportunities all the time in award management, so I don't think we'll ever be short of a job. However, the main kind of meat of what we wanted to talk about in here was that although we've now got the support for a lot of these jobs to be done across the kind of overall workflow, we need to really start thinking about improving the overall automation opportunities that come with it. So if you're introducing 1,000 manual tasks, that's got to be done 1,000 times. And there are elements of the flows that actually could be much more automatically kind of handled. So we've started to do some work on how we can smooth this process off. Obviously removing those manual tasks give us the opportunity to kind of remove the handling of repetitive tasks. It allows us to be able to kind of like, better kind of form the process, if you like. So remove those kind of disjoints within here, replacing those manual effort, any bottlenecks that might exist. So if you've got one extraordinarily busy contract manager who's having to kind of deal with loads and loads of requests that are now coming in because of something we've done, you're introducing problems, not solutions, right? So we want to improve that. Obviously, reducing delays, it's just a similar thing. So managing things like throughput reporting more effectively within here. But also better support for policy compliance, making sure that the right jobs always happen at the right times, and improving things like alerts and calls to action as we come. So a lot of goals that can be really improved ultimately through workflow automation. So we've done a bunch of stuff obviously around there. I've talked through quite a lot of these. So obviously the ability to control complex internal approvals, your choice of routing options, the milestones, the ability to kind of manage reviews, all those sort of task management, notifications, new email types that come through, et cetera, et cetera. They're all in there, right? So there's a ton of things in there that we've kind of done with it. So what we're now starting to look at is some of these areas, right? So this is an example flow we built out, and this is using our process manager. So these flows I'm going to walk through now, I can hasten to add, these are flows we've experimented with. We've been able to make work directly, but we haven't what we call productionized yet. Which is still not a real word in the English language. It definitely should be. But yeah, so what do they look like? So this flow that I've got physically showing here, for example, in here. So what are we doing within here? So essentially, let's look at things like reviews, right? So a classic example might be if I have an export control requirement that's required in there. So I have a funder or a collaborator on my grant that's coming through from an organization that's on a particular list. I need to check to make sure that the export licensing is correct for this particular grant. At the moment, what we can do here is we can say within the actual kind of workflow, by looking at the data, this funder is from a particular kind of list, therefore we must include a separate step. That step can be delegated to a known individual who is responsible for that process. But in doing that, for example, we could also create a review record, and that review record could in itself have a very pertinent list of questions that allow the investigator to reply, which we can then feedback on. We can look at those details. So what you want to do here is basically automatically create and send that review at the same time that we create that step in the process to the known individual. So we've got some functionality on these tasks here, which will allow us to be able to do that now. Now we've partially used this on the contract content site we've introduced. So whereas before for reviews you had to essentially kind of create the review as a request as an investigator or as a review editor, add in the appropriate template, send it to the right individual, and then deal with that afterwards. The first half of that, which is selecting the right template, assigning that particular kind of survey to the right individual, is now all handled entirely automatically. So that can be done quite easily now. So that's a good first point. The second part basically is then saying, okay, right, well, what do I do at that point there? So I might say, fine, well, actually, I now want to send an email to somebody to say, actually, hello, export manager, we've just sent a review to James to be able to fill in, so you should expect something back from them recently. Or it could alternately be something like, for example, in 2 weeks' time, if I haven't heard back from the PI, I want to get a notification to say, James hasn't replied to this, therefore we've got a problem because we're going to hit the point where we've got 2 weeks before the deadline date, we can't do what we need to do, and so on and so forth. So automation of email sending. And that also gives us the ability to be able to kind of create more customized email templates as well, which is often the kind of nice kind of bonus we get from within the process there. We can also kind of look at those reviews, right? So in terms of actually then who has to physically go through the process, it might be that actually what we want to try and do here is just simply say, okay, right, actually that review has to have been passed or completed. It could be a set of milestones, for example, that needs to be completed. And at the point when we get a notification that that review has been approved, without having to actually go in and approve that manually, the task can be automatically approved to move through the process. So you can start to see there how, for example, creation of kind of a type, send it to somebody, they fill it in, they send it back, that job is done, automatically moves on through the process. No one's had to touch that at all other than the PI answering the questions potentially. So again, some ways of really kind of improving that. So we've got that kind of thing tied in here, and the way we have that sort of hooked in, it essentially loops back to the approval workflow again. So in the event that that approval is, so if it's not approved, we basically kind of make that call, send it back to the start of that process, and then get the either the export control manager or whoever we designated that to start again, or we could even potentially just kind of then close out the application at that point in time. We've also introduced this ability to be able to kind of create milestones automatically. So as well as the same thing we can do with reviews. So I can, for example, now say, oh, okay, in this particular case here, I've got 5 core tasks that I need to get created, assigned to particular approved responsible users, and they have to do all those before we can then move on again. So again, if grant equals X, then these milestones need to be completed. They have to be added automatically. And again, in terms of the automation process around that, we can then start to say things like, okay, well, fine. If only 4 out of these 5 milestones have been completed at the end of this cycle, we can't approve and move on. So that actually actively prevents you from being able to kind of move on, even as a manual approver. It's a little bit similar to the way we handle the we'll call the information requests at the moment, if any of you are familiar with that. So if through the actual kind of path of the cycle, somebody has asked a question about the workflow, it locks out the ability to be able to kind of move that through until that question has been properly answered and resolved. And then the last part of that, again, this is actually something we have introduced in the production instance, which is the ability to be able to kind of action these timer-based tasks. So a very, very frequent request we get on workflows is to say, for example, we, the research office, must have all this work completed and approved 2 weeks prior to the submission deadline date. And at the moment, it's kind of hard to be able to kind of do that. But what we've got this now is these kind of timer boundary events that are on some of the user tasks. And this will let me say that in one of 2 ways. I can say the timer starts when that task starts. So we can say, okay, right, if it's taken more than 2 weeks since this timer was triggered and something hasn't happened, I can then put out an escalation to, for example, a head of department to say, hang on, James hasn't done his job properly. Why not? Equally, we can say the timer counts backwards from a fixed date. So we say submission deadline date is the end of October. So 2 weeks prior to that, if this hasn't been completed by then we need to basically kind of either escalate, or we could potentially even abandon the entire application and say, I'm sorry, guys, you were too late. More typically, what happens is we would escalate to head department to say, are you happy for us to continue with this one? Because actually, they failed to hit that date, and we can record that. So we can record the fact they've missed their SLA deadline at that same point in time. So there's a lot of new opportunities of things that we can kind of bring in here to kind of help with that overall automation of the process. Yeah. So ultimately, the kind of goal on all this. So We've gone through the process of creating these enhancements. They are part of we're kind of experimental kind of strand. They're not in the actual production instance yet, and we do this quite a lot. So there's always a lot of kind of experimentation, discovery work that goes on in the background along the time we're kind of building things out. But when we do this, we plan to have that. I mean, we expect there to be increased efficiency overall in terms of how we can kind of support our workflows within here. We hope it will improve decision making. So research manager will be better informed decisions because of the tasks that require within there, and the experience should be better. So there should be less clicks, which is a big issue for us, right? We have far too many kind of functions that all have independent kind of click-through routes. And ultimately, to be able to do more with less, if you've got a smaller unit, 2 or 3 individuals working on these things, some of these more granular tasks are just they're luxury items in a lot of cases. So be able to automate a lot of these and actually kind of be sort of proxy administrator, if you like, in that regard, will help you do more. Yeah, so essentially kind of that is the goal here once we've implemented all things to be able to sort of improve the overall workflow further. And that is the end of my specifics. Any questions within there?
I know it's a small room, but just for the recording, we'll just have to use. Thanks, Ash.
Thanks, James. This is all looking really great and really exciting. Of all the features on here I want to ask about, would you be able to expand on the email customization that you mentioned and how much you plan that we'd be able to customize the emails going out?
Yeah, okay, so at the moment, the tool we're using for this process manager basically lets us create this kind of email task, if you like, within there. And essentially what we did there was we just hooked that in as a sort of text kind of manifest that then connects through to the pure email system. But the benefit of that is we're no longer relying on the specific pure hard-coded email. So in the actual kind of workflow, we can build the email we want to put out, and we can top and tail it then with some standard stuff from the pure setup. So the headers and the footers that we go within there. And it's a little bit like, and I'm just trying to think of an equivalent part of the system where this works. So like in the text resources are pure, sometimes you can put like an ID in a curly brackets ID. So we can do things like that. So the existing example we have lets us put the pure ID for the actual application in the record. You can click on it and then you can click through to the root. So that's just one example. We could probably extend that to include more specific details. But it will say dear James, or dear applicant, dear James, whatever. So applicant brackets, and then we come through the record ID and bits and pieces. So we can do quite a lot. There are limitations to it. There's like a maximum sizes and these sorts of things, but it gives us much more flexibility. That's right.
For the features that were working but not yet productionized, do you have a timeline for when they'll be productionized?
I knew you were going to ask me that. Damn you. Wait. No is the short answer, if I'm really honest. I mean, the thing is we have them working. So the first kind of half hurdle has been crossed. Now the timer task and the email tasks are actually already in your instance. All right. So I can create timer boundary tasks and associated emails on existing kind of workflows using the BPMN setup. But there are components of that, like I was sort of talking about some of the, so we can do the ID thing at the moment on the emails, but we can't do an awful lot more, so they're a bit blank. So there's more work required in there, but I would consider that to be some additional tasks on existing kind of sprints. I don't think it'll be a big deal. But the bigger stuff around the automatic review creation, it is a chunk of work for us to do, and it really just comes down to roadmap planning. And I would probably say it'll be within a year, but I couldn't be absolutely certain as to when that will be. Yeah, a bit woolly, I'm afraid. Yeah, but
Hi, James.
Hey,
so one of the things that we get asked about a lot at our institution and have struggled with over the years is being able to measure the time taken to do some of these processes. And it sounds a lot from what you're saying that might be something that becomes a little bit easier, hopefully, in the future. We've struggled in the past at not being able to report on perhaps status changes, when somebody's undertaken a task. Will that be something that will be built into this? Because that's really important for us.
So you can do that now with the BPMN setup. So we introduced, actually this was something that when we spoke to Monash when we were doing this setup, actually, we introduced it. So we call throughput reporting. So for each individual step that you include in your BPMN processing, you can add that in as a step on the reports themselves, and then we retain that as history. So essentially you can say, export control manager step, and the day it went in, the day it went out, and the days in step are recorded as well. So you can actually kind of do full per application throughput reporting based on individual steps. And the idea there, of course, is you can look through there and say, well, actually, of the 20 steps we have in our flow, there's one step, that's sort of step 7, that always takes 5 times as long as the rest of them. Why is that? And then work on it. And it can be legitimate, but it's just that it's much easier to do that now, yeah.
Hey, James. Great stuff. I wanted to ask you something about commitments. You mentioned that yesterday. I didn't see that today, but I wanted you to elaborate a little bit more. How and when are we going to expect to use that?
So commitments is in there now. So you can use that. We extended the XML to allow you to be able to kind of record that data. And we also extended the tables, so the award project tables, because it's an award thing, obviously. And yeah, that's now possible to do. So you can record on the commitments per period against the account lines that are linked in the system. So there's an option in the awards XML synchronization setup in the back end. There's a further option where you can kind of click, which gives you the ability to then include in your expenditure details, and then include within the commitment details. So if you want to know more about that, we can kind of like give you the release notes of it. Yeah, so you can do it now.
Okay, I think that's it, James. And thank you as always. I always get excited with. I like where you started. It's the best module in Pure, but it has changed so much over the years that it sort of doesn't recognise what it was a number of years ago. And if you haven't looked at a lot of the new features and things like that, I really encourage you to go back to the release notes, talk to relevant Pure people, because there's just so much under the bonnet that each release, I don't have time to go under the system and have a look at it, but I'm always excited to go, oh, that's there now. Oh, that's good. You know, and it's something else that I'm learning myself. Every release, there's always lots of stuff going on.
Yeah, actually, on that note, we for that very reason, we did a webinar relatively recently, which was basically a second look webinar, because there are a lot of functions, as you say, that are new within the last couple of years, and we had a lot of customers who said, "Oh yeah, I looked at award management once, but it wasn't for us." And now it's just going to give them a chance to go back again and then just take a second look at all the new functionalities there, and that's available on the Help Center. On the Pure support pages as a recorded webinar. So if you do want to go back and look at that again, then you can go and do so.
Perfect. And with that, we'll end. Thanks, James.